Kyone, what are you doing?
I'm getting rid of all my Democratic memorabilia. I'm quitting the party, Greg. Goodbye, Gary Hart campaign button. Goodbye, Bill Bradley for president bumper sticker. Goodbye, big poster of the young, cute 1988 Al Gore. You know what? Maybe I'll keep that one for sexual purposes.
What's causing this?
I woke up. That's what. I was standing in line at IHOP, and I had this epiphany.
International House of Pancakes.
Yes, international. Don't you see? New World Order. One world government. Belgian waffles. Look on the back of a $1 bill. What do you find?
The Great Seal of the United States.
No, Greg, it's a pancake with a pyramid made of bacon and an eyeball made of boysenberry syrup.
So what are you going to do?
Become a Republican and support the only candidate who's brave enough to speak against IHOP, Rand Paul. Greg, he's an eye doctor. There's an eyeball on my money. Eye doctor. Eye. You get it?
He dropped out of the race today.
They got to him. Greg, liberty's dead. Kneel before your stateless pancake overlords.
So what will you do?
Become a libertarian. I think I was one all along. Besides, their nominating convention is in Orlando, so I get to double down on Goofy. I'm going to book my plane tickets. You listen to this show on Party Switchers. And now his fleeting affair with Nelson Rockefeller changed him forever. Colin McEnroe.
And I want to emphasize it was a fleeting affair. But I did get to find out why his wife was called Happy Rockefeller, if you know what I mean. All right, so today we're going to talk about why people switch their political orientations. And some of these switches are going to be really wholesale switches of political orientation as opposed to party. Some of the people depicted in our guest Daniel Oppenheimer's book, Exit Right, are people who were way to the left and then moved way to the right. But we also thought, well, so this is a book called Exit Right. It's about people who do. The subtitle is The People Who Left the Left and Reshaped the American Century by joining the right. But we thought, well, that's, we'd like to talk to somebody else who kind of went the other way. One name that popped right into my mind is somebody whose work I've admired a lot over the years, Michael Lind, a co-founder of the New America Foundation and author of several books, including Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States, and, perhaps most pertinently, Up From Conservatism, Why the Right is Wrong for America. So we've got the traffic moving in both directions here. And if you have things that you want to say to us about why you might have switched political orientations at some point, give us a call, 860-275-7266. Even better, tweet at us at WNPR Colin. Daniel Oppenheimer, we're going to begin with you, Director of Communications for the Hogg Foundation for Mental Health at the University of Texas at Austin. And you've got like a book signing event, too. We should plug that before I forget, right?
Yeah, that's right. And thanks for having me, Colin. Tonight in South Hadley at the Odyssey Bookshop at 7 o'clock, I will be reading and signing and being in profound ways, I think.
Right. You'll be. He will be in South Hadley. That's Massachusetts. It's up by the Five College area. So go up there and see him. But hear him now. And so let's just begin with this. I'm going to have both of you talk about this a little bit. But I guess I'm curious to know, first of all, Daniel, you could have written a book that had Michael Lind and David Brock and Hillary Clinton in it, too. People who maybe went left to right. Right to left. Who went right to left. I'm going to struggle to get the directions right. Who went right to left? I mean, Hillary Clinton was a Goldwater girl in 1964. She's running for president as a Democrat now. So you could have covered both sides. Was there a reason that the left to right direction was the one that you were the most interested in?
So, yeah, and I'd say there are two reasons. One of them, and I'd be interested to hear Michael's take on this, is I think the left-right phenomenon has been more significant politically, and the people who are the people I write about and then other people who've gone from the left to right, I think have played a bigger role particularly in the intellectual history in America in the 20th century. So that's one reason. The other one is a very personal one, which is I grew up on the left. And though I remain on the left, a lot of my own intellectual, political, emotional process and struggle has been with the orthodoxies of the left, with what I see as its flaws, with some of the people on the left, sometimes with my parents. And so that's the sort of struggle that's personally deeply interesting to me. And in a way, this book, though there's no me in it, there's no first person, there's nothing about my story. In a way, it's my working through of some of my issues with the left and thinking about why people went further than I have and actually left.
Yeah, your brother would have put a lot more of himself in it.
He warned me that he warned me there might be some missiles coming his way.
All right, so Mark Oppenheimer is Daniel's brother. He's on the show all the time. So Michael Lind, let's talk about that for a second too, and maybe a place to start is to talk about your conversion, and maybe that's the wrong word, but your conversion, my recollection of your conversion, reading about it at the time, was that it actually even involved maybe some of the neocon figures who people Daniel's book. Explain how you went from the right to at least sort of the left of center side.
Well, I think you have to distinguish people who stayed in one place and then the borders moved and they found themselves in a different country from those who actually did undergo a deep philosophical conversion and defected from their homeland and moved to another country. In my case, I've pretty much stayed where my views coalesced in youth. I'm a Kennedy, Johnson, Humphrey, 60s liberal. In the 70s and 80s, this made me a neoconservative, as the term was defined at the time. In the 90s, this made me a centrist, and today it makes me somewhat left of center. So I really haven't moved at all that much in my views. But the political landscape keeps shifting around. Now, and there are other cases, including some in the book, which I look forward to reading, like Whittaker Chambers, where there's a true conversion. So in other words, it's not simply a matter of shifting party coalitions where somebody with the same philosophical views ends up in one rather than another a decade later. But it's a real kind of personal spiritual transformation, but that was not my case.
Well, I'm going to come back to that, Michael, in just a second. I'm going to press you on that a little bit. But before I do, Daniel, a lot of the people in your book would say some version of what Michael's saying right now. I mean, Reagan famously said, "I didn't leave the party left me." That a lot of people who switch think they didn't change very much.
Right, and I would say just my back of the book calculation. I'm not implicating you in this, Michael, but is that 90% of that is bogus. I mean that it certainly that wasn't true of Reagan. Maybe Christopher Hitchens, sort of the people I wrote about, would say that as well. But I think most of the time that's not true, and I think it's reflective of the fact that it's actually very hard to admit that you've changed. In some ways, it's easier to say that the whole country has changed or the party has changed than it is to admit that you believe things that are different from what you used to believe, because these, our political beliefs are deeply bound up in who we are and our sense of ourselves. I'm not saying it's never true, and I utterly believe, Michael, that was true in his case. But certainly if you're thinking about somebody like Ronald Reagan, it just wasn't true. I mean, he moved to the right, but he didn't want to admit that he had moved to the right as much as he had.
Well, no, I agree entirely about Reagan, since he went from being a 4-time voter for Franklin Roosevelt to, 15 years later denouncing Social Security and the TVA. So that was a genuine conversion. It also was you had genuine conversion on the part of some of my former neoconservative mentors like Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz, who wrote an essay in the mid-'90s, basically saying neoconservatism is dead, we're just conservatives.
Well, Norman Podhoretz gets a whole chapter in Daniel's book, and I'll throw it back to Daniel in a second. But my sense for you, Michael, was that you felt as though people like Podhoretz kind of hijacked the party, and then instead of steering it down the center, kind of caved a bit to the Buchanan factions and some of the other, considerably more right-leaning groups. But that in some ways this is a story of people. What you saw changing in the party that pushed you, maybe it didn't push you in a different direction, but pushed you to think of yourself and your place on the spectrum in a different way, is a story of some of people, including some of the people in Daniel's book.
Well, I think that's right. If you look more recently, the migration has been from the relative right to the relative left. I was one of the early ones, but among my former conservative or neoconservative colleagues, Francis Fukuyama, Bruce Bartlett, Bruce Bauer, Andrew Sullivan, David Frum, Fareed Zakaria, David Brock. Fareed Zakaria and I met at Bill Buckley's house in Stamford, Connecticut in the mid-'80s. So
that was a party, right? That was a crazy party.
And so in that case, my own perception is I don't want to get too deeply into the personal, but all the way up until the early 1990s, there was a distinct neoconservative movement where they were still insisting, a number of the older ones, that they were really just paleo-liberals. This term neoconservative had been thrown at them by Michael Harrington. And that was when I joined that movement. And then the people who led the movement basically liquidated the movement. And they said that, well, no, we're not paleo-liberals after all. We're kind of mainstream conventional right-wing Republicans. And one can speculate about their motives for doing so. But essentially, they simply joined the mainstream conservative movement by the middle of the 1990s, and I think it's a pity because I think the neoconservatives were much more in tune with the modern post-New Deal, post-civil rights era than the much more reactionary right that they moved into.
So, Daniel, let's tell a story. Maybe you can give us like the 90-second version of the Whittaker Chambers story. We can talk about how one of these transformations happens.
So Whittaker Chambers became a communist and a Communist Party member in the 1920s. He was relatively well-known within that world for writing some communist-inspired fiction when he was tapped by the communist underground to be a spy. And so he was a spy throughout most of the 1930s. And at the very end of the 1930s, he broke with the party. He had an actual religious conversion. He was praying one day. He was beaten down by the whole life of being a spy in all sorts of ways, and had begun to sort of read about all the problems with communism in the Soviet Union. And he had a genuine sort of spiritual conversion. Left the party for a while. Was kind of unaffiliated. Wrote at Time magazine. Became a noted anti-communist, and then was one of the founding editors of National Review when William F. Buckley started that. So that's a 90-second version.
Well, I'll give you another 30 seconds. I mean, some of this, had to do. I mean, it seems to me Whittaker Chambers' story is one of identity too.
Yeah.
And there's, the other part of that identity was being a closeted gay man.
Yeah, and the other part of the identity, and I don't think he would deny this, and I don't think this is a reason to dismiss his politics, is he was a kind of deeply troubled, tormented soul, had a kind of profoundly unhappy childhood. His father was a closeted gay man or closeted bisexual. They had a really dysfunctional family, and from the time he was very young, he had a kind of apocalyptic personality, and his brother committed suicide, had a profound effect on him, and he felt a calling to redeem the world in some fashion. And initially, Marxism and communism were the vehicles through which he wanted to do that. And then when that fell apart, he sort of reconstituted himself as a Christian, anti-communist conservative ultimately. But yeah, this is deeply embedded in identity and pain and sometimes pathology, though I think we have to be careful about throwing that around.
So, one thing that happens a lot in Daniel Oppenheimer's book, Exit Right, is that people move from the far left. A lot of them are red diaper babies or something pretty close to that, to a pretty far right, certainly in the case of somebody like David Horowitz, and we'll come to him in just a second. But, Michael Lind, I know that you don't necessarily stop there in terms of sort of talking about worldview, right? I mean, there's left, there's right. There's a lot in between. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, about how all of us ultimately have to kind of identify or gravitate, or we do anyway, identify or gravitate to some kind of worldview.
Well, because we don't have a multi-party system in the United States, unlike most democracies, we tend to think everything is Democratic or Republican, which becomes synonymous with left and right. But obviously the left, has Marxists, it has neoliberal New Democrats, it has moderate, old-fashioned labor liberals who really have different worldviews. And the same is true on the right. The libertarians have next to nothing to do with the religious right, except for common enemies in the federal government. So I think if the consistent worldviews are not so much conservatism and liberalism or progressivism, they're smaller than that. So there's populism of the Donald Trump, Patrick Buchanan kind. Really, it's a separate worldview of its own. It's called on the right, and happens to be there because of the Republican alliance. But if this were Europe, there would be a separate populist party and a separate libertarian or classical liberal party, and we wouldn't discuss these different groups in the same breath.
One of the questions that is probably hard to answer, Daniel Oppenheimer, is sort of what I think of. Actually, I'm stealing this from Jules Feiffer, the Batman Superman question. So with Superman, Superman is the reality, and Clark Kent is the disguise. With Batman, Bruce Wayne is the reality. Batman is the disguise. And as you look at the 6 protagonists of your book, one of the questions you could ask is which was the disguise and which was the reality. In other words, with some of these people, it might be argued that the pretense or the thing that they talked themselves into were their leftist leanings, and they ultimately, like a river seeking its own bed, got back to what they really absolutely were at bedrock. And for others, it might be a different kind of thing where ultimately the right was the costume that they put on when they decided to be a different kind of superhero. I don't know. You want to react to that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting way of framing it, and it makes sense in the context of different people. So, for instance, I always felt when I was reading about Ronald Reagan, who was a solid Roosevelt New Deal liberal for about half his life, that temperamentally there was something in him that sought out conservatism. And one of the interesting things I came across when I was reading about him is that people were approaching him about running for office as a Republican years before he ever gave any inkling that his policies aligned with that, or that he was interested at all in that identity. I think temperamentally he was conservative. Chambers, again, there's different kind of political vehicles that can be allow somebody to express a kind of characterological disposition. So I think he had a religious kind of personality. People have accused Marxism or communism of being a kind of faith, but I think he fit into the Christian form of faith better than he did the Marxist one. Absolutely. Somebody like David Horowitz, I don't think David Horowitz would ever have become a conservative if there hadn't been this very particular traumatic event in his life that sort of exploded his whole left-wing identity and forced him to find a new one.
Yeah, and that was the murder of somebody working for the Black Panthers, somebody that he had basically recommended to go work for the Black Panthers, and so he felt a tremendous culpability about that. And I want to come back to that. And I want to come back to David Horowitz, who I feel like might be kind of all 6 people in your book are kind of outliers from each other in different ways. They're not cut from the same bolt of cloth. But Michael Lind, I don't know, maybe I overemphasize this. I've been thinking a lot about this over the last year or so, but it seems to me that, not everybody has a really well worked out, coherent political philosophy that they can explain, that they can sort of, in fact, I'm not even sure Hillary Clinton does, but that we can just sort of say, right, here's what I believe this, and this. But what they do is gravitate towards people who look like them. If they feel like ducks, they stand around with other ducks. They don't stand with swans. And I'm wondering for you, obviously you just rattled off a bunch of names of people that you could go out and have cheeseburgers with who were kind of with you as nominal conservatives at one point and are still with you nominally at the center, or maybe a trickle left of center. But what about milieu in general? When I say milieu, I'm talking about really boring quotidian things like the way people dress, the way people talk, the music they like, what's in your glass of alcohol when you drink. It seems to me that one of the difficulties of switching, of moving, is leaving a group of people who are familiar to you in other ways.
No, that's exactly right. And unless you're willing to lose friends, you don't want to break, with that milieu. And I think particularly in the case of the neoconservatives more than of the Reagan Chambers generation, because a lot of the older ones tended to be kind of maverick intellectuals or loners. But a lot of the neoconservatives, they were this very tightly knit social group from the time they were young Trotskyists or whatever to, 50s liberals and 80s neoconservatives. And I think it was very important for them to be part of this lifelong circle of friends. And then when a sufficient number had moved from the Democrats to the Republicans, then, very few of them had the psychological independence to stand up to that and just to sunder their relationships.
We're getting a tweet from Red Menace tweeting, "It's unlikely that I could trade my political beliefs for the opposite." Extremely unlikely. But Daniel, kind of the point of your book is most of these people were not weekend warriors at what they were. They were people who would have regarded it as very, David Horowitz was not a casual leftist. He was about as deep-dyed a leftist as you could be.
That's right, and I think that the people I'm writing about are outliers, and particularly in that sense, they're people who lived politics, in sort of profound, deep, thoroughgoing ways. I think it was harder for them, so I'm not sure if this is disagreeing with Red Menace, but it was actually harder for them than it would be for most of us to change political beliefs because it was deeply embedded in their identity. And it was also, as Michael was talking about, often, even the ones who were loners in some ways, it was of the community they were a part of. And so it was difficult. It was often traumatic, and I think one of the things, when you look at somebody like Donald Trump and the ability of so many of his voters to ignore the fact that he's been a Democrat 2 or 3 times, he's been a Republican 2 or 3 times, he's held policies all over the map. That's actually an indication of how much easier it is, I think, for maybe the average not hyper-political person to switch or be kind of fluid in terms of their attachments than it is for the type of people that I was writing about.
Although for Horowitz, and here I do have to say this. Okay, so for you and your Horowitz chapter with him casting his first Reagan vote in 84, I think. But the truth is, David Horowitz has gone on to be kind of, well, in my way of thinking, just bat poop crazy, and I mean, he really has become whatever he was as a leftist. He's become more of a rightist than that, and really he's the kind of guy who's, first of all, he's set up a foundation with his name on it, which is also always a bad sign, and it's like the David Horowitz Freedom Foundation or something, and he's like the kind of guy who calls Barack Obama a neo-communist traitor. I mean, that would be a very typical average day of the week. That's not David when he gets out of bed on the wrong side. That's an average day. That John Kerry and Barack Obama are neo-communist traitors, which to me is an absurd statement. I mean, Barack Obama has very heavy ties to Wall Street. By no stretch of the imagination is this a defensible statement. And so that I look at Horowitz and I think, well, he's just a guy who's going to be very extreme about whatever he's going to be.
I think that's right, but I think if you back to that question you had about sort of what's the disguise and what's the reality, he is somebody, he has gotten very extreme. He was relatively extreme on the left, but I would say had a lot more years of relative sanity and normalcy on the left than he has on the right for sort of a complicated series of reasons. But among them, this friend of his you mentioned who was murdered. And I think he's been out there maybe on his own to an extent that some of the people I write about were not. So even somebody like, Norman Podhoretz and Irving Kristol, these neoconservatives, there was a community of relatively sort of complicated, often sane people who they remained a part of even when they went over to the right, who probably tethered them somewhat more than is the case for Horowitz.
And, we have to take a break here pretty soon, but Michael Lind, so one way of looking at this is people are what they are. And maybe in the next segment we'll talk about how people get to be the way they are, how both of you got to be the way that you are. And then something happens. Something happens. Capital S, capital H, Joseph Heller, something happens. And so, so one very simplistic argument, which is the only kind I am capable of making, is that liberal Jews ultimately switched because they felt they had to choose between Israel and their liberalism, that somehow or other that, was a precipitating, shaping event for neocons, and that comparably maybe Dixiecrats moved to become Republicans because they weren't comfortable with the civil rights movement. So you've got Strom Thurmond and all the other Stromites kind of moving in that direction. And so what really happens is that something happens. There's a precipitating event, things change, whether it's a war in the Middle East or the civil rights movement in the U.S., and people think, I got to move. Maybe partisanship and ideology aren't the same thing, but there's something I've got to do right now because I can't do the old thing anymore.
Well, I disagree to the extent that I think that the emphasis on temperament, and particularly apocalyptic temperament, is more important than any particular triggering events, which may be important in an individual's life and career. In my experience, just thinking back, the neoconservatives who had been moderate Roosevelt Democrats pretty much did not go over to the far right. People like Nathan Glazer, Jean Kirkpatrick, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who became just a kind of center-right or even centrist liberal Democratic senator in the 1990s from New York after having been a neoconservative. Whereas the ones who came from communist backgrounds or had been communists or Trotskyists, like James Burnham and David Horowitz, they were more likely to become extreme conservatives. And I think the continuity was they despised liberalism. They despised it from the left, and then they despised it from the right. And they view liberalism as something not so much dangerous as weak and pathetic and incapable of any kind of heroic achievement. So I would put more emphasis on the moderates versus the apocalyptic revolutionaries.
All right, we have to pause there. This is an interesting conversation. We'll come back for more of it after this.
Now listen up, people party, they say parties are fun. What kind of party? There are many parties, you pick one.
Now listen here, people party, they say party means dance.
What kind of dance?
You gotta get in your political stance.
Some people are Democrats, others are Republicans. Some people have other parties, are you a part of one?
Some people are Democrats, others are Republicans.
All right, we're back. And we're talking about people who shift their political philosophies or their political allegiances. Daniel Oppenheimer's book, Exit Right, is about the people who left the left and reshaped the American century. These are, it's actually 6 people, Whittaker Chambers, James Burnham, Ronald Reagan, Norman Podhoretz, David Horowitz, and Christopher Hitchens. And then joining us also from NPR DC studios, Michael Lind, co-founder of the New America Foundation and the author of many books, including Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States, and most relevantly, Up from Conservatism, Why the Right is Wrong for America. So Michael Lind is often cited as somebody who moved in the other direction, although he would say that the landscape shifted. He stayed in the same place, and the landscape moved around. You know, it might be interesting just to sort of talk about, okay, so to whatever extent any of us does have a political philosophy, where does it come from? So, Daniel, I'm going to start with you. I mean, this is something that you're interrogating your 6 protagonists about. I mean, apostrophically anyway. They're not actually there for you to interrogate. But so where do you think your political ideas come from?
So I did some research on this in terms of like how predictive our parents' politics are of ours recently. And it depends on how political a household you come from. But one of the things that I found was if you come from a political household, it's actually very predictive. So if you look at me, I was born in Massachusetts to left-wing Jewish parents. Every community that I've been a part of, every city that I've lived in has been a pretty deep blue place. The odds, frankly, that I was going to be a conservative were incredibly slim. So there's that piece of it in terms of just the broad political coordinates. And then I think there's the temperamental stuff, which is I'm temperamentally predisposed to looking for the gray, to looking for nuance, to kind of trying to dissolve dichotomies that I think are too simplistic, and that kind of explains something about what kind of left-winger I am, which is the kind who writes a book about why people leave the left. And probably if I, could be the exact same person but have been raised in a conservative household, maybe I would be the conservative who's always annoying his friends because he's questioning conservative orthodoxies.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Michael? I just want to say that everything you just said is fascinating, and we've done a lot of other shows with people like Drew Weston and George Lakoff and people like that about where in fact these ideas come from, how tied they may be to either our environment or our neurology or our Myers-Briggs type or whatever. But Michael, where do you feel as though your ideas come from?
Well, I think my values come from my family and my community. I'm a 5th-generation native of Austin, Texas. In Central Texas,
my hometown
was
by the
always
way. Now it's my hometown, Austin.
Now
well.
It is. Well,
yep.
well, welcome.
Yeah.
Keep Austin weird.
Right. It's too late.
But
anyway.
From the time that Austin voted against secession during the Civil War to the present, Central Texas was more progressive. And the great formative battle in the generation before my own was that of the young LBJ and the supporters of Franklin Roosevelt against the neo-Confederate Dixiecrats. And so I'm rooted in that somewhat provincial political culture. It's a quite different political culture from that of the Northeastern intellectuals, including some of my mentors like Irving Kristol and others. In terms of temperament, I'm just naturally ornery. So, when people tell me I have to agree to some party line, I'm inclined to push back on it. But
go ahead. No, you finish your thought.
Now, I think you get your values from somewhere. But on the other hand, I do think, if you're an intellectual or a scholar or thoughtful political participant, you then look for it's not simply reinforcing what you already believe, but sometimes testing it. And if you're intelligent, you change your mind. If the family community values don't really seem to fit the world. And in my case, there was a great crisis in the 1980s when essentially the New Deal tradition was not represented any longer. You had the New Left of the 60s was very strong. And then you had the neoconservatives, who were sort of refugees from the New Deal, and the so-called old right or movement conservatives led by William F. Buckley Jr. And I think, that's something else. When you're in your 20s and 30s, there are certain options that are available to you, certain schools of thought. And, even if you come from a background with different values and traditions, if you're going to be politically involved, you sort of have to choose one of the 2 or 3 or 4 schools.
Right,
that are extant when you're in college or early adulthood.
Right. It seems to me that we have sort of two ways in. There may be more, and certainly the old saw about the person who isn't a liberal in his youth has no heart and isn't a conservative as he becomes older has no brain. I don't think that's true at all. But what I do think is true that you kind of have two choices. One of them is you inherit stuff from your parents, your family, your milieu, and then you probably don't waver all that much. That's sort of one. And then the other one is kind of heuristics, right? You maybe you inherit something and then. That may be the first time I've ever studied heuristics on public radio. Yeah. No, actually, there'll be a ceremony afterwards. It's like a bar mitzvah. I get prizes for saying heuristics on NPR. But heuristics is kind of testing, right? Testing the waters, kind of looking around, saying, "Well, does this make sense? Does this?" For me, I think that's been much more the case. My parents were Goldwater Republicans, and I think they kind of expected that I would be too. And it's you start testing things and saying, "Well, that doesn't seem true," or that. And when I started out as a reporter here in Connecticut in the late 70s, where the Republicans were by far a much more honorable group of people because they had no power whatsoever. So all they could do was stick up for ideals and ethics, and point out how completely power mad and unethical the Democrats were, and they weren't wrong about that. So it was easy for me to carry a little bit of this mild Republican light forward, and then I just started running into other things that heuristically didn't work for me, and I'm a registered Democrat. I just took some kind of test, and I was a 99% identification with Bernie Sanders. So my mother is turning over in her grave somewhere. But that, Daniel, seems to me to be a lot of it. But then maybe, and Michael's used the word temperament, I think maybe you have too, then you have a guy like Christopher Hitchens, who is somebody that Michael knew quite well, so you'll both be able to talk a little bit about him. But for Hitchens, I feel that temperament is almost first. He's a polemicist first. And in the ways that Michael was talking about at the end of the last segment, I guess to use the perfect Christopher Hitchens analogy, he doesn't want any water in his bourbon. He wants to take it straight. So if he's going to be on the left, he's going to be hardcore, no water, no ice on the left. If he's going to go to the right, maybe he's going to do the same thing. And he's going to do so polemically in each case.
I think you're absolutely right about the heuristics. Do I get an award too?
Yeah.
And I think the trick and one of the things that I explore a lot in the book and what's so complicated for all of us is what does it mean to sort of hold healthy political beliefs and be open to experience while acknowledging how much we're the creatures of our circumstance and our history and the values we were given by our parents and just recognizing the just utterly brute fact that if we had been born in a different time and place, our politics would have profoundly different content. I don't even think you can argue with that. Hitchens was interesting. So you're absolutely right about his sort of polemical temperament. One of the things that was interesting about him was he tried so hard to sort of evade all the pitfalls of history and the ways that people can be mislaid by context and affiliation and loyalty, and it failed him in the end. I remember there was just this really sort of poignant moment when he was, and I'm not sure how much he was trying to figure out where to be on Iraq. But I almost feel like the clincher was his great hero, Václav Havel, one of the great sort of moral figures of the 20th century, came out for the Iraq War. And for Hitchens, it was like it gave him this permission to be for this because he had this incredibly sophisticated, he thought, algorithm for how to arrive at the correct belief and avoid all the pitfalls. And even that failed him. And And he kind of wasn't able to process that ultimately, I think, in part because of the temperament that you're talking about.
If you read Daniel's book for no other reason, read it for the Saul Billow dinner party anecdote. It's so great. It's just a great Hitchens story. So, Michael Lind, you did know Christopher Hitchens well enough to sit down with him over dinner and or drinks and talk some things out. And so here's this guy who goes from really being, good old-fashioned Marxist to a supporter of the policies of George W. Bush. How do you see that particular journey?
Well, I think of all of the individuals in Daniel's book, which I look forward to reading, I'm not sure Christopher Hitchens belongs. I think to his dying day, well, he told me this late in life, when we were still on good terms, that he still considered himself a Trotskyist. And I think to his dying day, he believed that he was being a consistent Trotskyist. His big campaign, other than George Bush's foreign policy, was this militant anti-clericalism, militant atheism. He never, to my knowledge, signed up with free market economics, the other defining characteristic of the right. And I think it was mad, but I think in his own view, the United States, in a kind of Hegelian way, the cunning of history, by destroying these clerical fascist regimes in the Middle East, was promoting some kind of democratic, Trotskyist, even socialist revolution. I think it was crazy, but I think it was kind of consistent. And in that sense, I would distinguish Christopher Hitchens from James Burnham, whom he most closely resembles. Because Burnham, who is also in the book, I understand, was one of Trotsky's deputies in the United States.
That's right.
But he broke completely with any kind of Marxism and had no sympathy towards Trotskyism later on and became a very reactionary conservative. I'm just not, now, if Hitchens had lived longer, he might have done so, but I'm just not sure that he broke with the left on anything other than foreign policy.
Well, I think there's also, I do think Hitchens, in some ways, all of these protagonists are different from one another, but I think Hitchens is really interesting that way. But Daniel, the other thing is, Hitchens was kind of famously oppositional, and he enjoyed kicking balls more than he cared what shape the ball was. So that even when he's at The Nation for 20 years, he's got a column called Minority Report, which is kind of a tip-off right away that I'm going to say things that probably will discomfit the core readers of this left-leaning magazine. I'm going to think of ways in which some of their shibboleths are easily discardable.
Yeah, and just to get personal on it, I think in a way you're right, Michael, that he's a little bit of an odd man out. Reagan is in a different way in the book. The irony is, in a sense, the book is formed around him because when I started reading Christopher Hitchens when I was in college and started reading Minority Report, it was profoundly liberating and exciting for me, and it was precisely what you were just talking about, Colin, his sense of freedom to just, I describe him in the book as kind of like the Waldorf and Statler of the left, sort of sitting up in the balcony lobbing insults. That was profoundly exciting to me and liberating, and when he started moving away from the left, though never to the right in a sense, and really cutting sort of familial ties in a very dramatic way, that was difficult for me. And part of the sort of the germ of this book is me sort of wrestling what that meant to me for someone who was a real hero of mine. So it's true that he remained that kind of malcontent and dissident. I think what is also true is he in very decisive ways turned on the left in a way that was different from what he had done before. He severed ties with the nation. He started insulting people whom he'd previously been admirers of in ways that he just never would have before. So, it's complicated. He never became a conservative, but I think he left the left in a pretty decisive way.
And it might go back to Michael's point about hating liberals or liberalism.
Yeah, and I was so glad you made that point, by the way, Michael. It's not in the book explicitly, but it's something that I've thought about a lot. A lot of these guys on the left and the right, they just have a sort of profound contempt for liberals, which unites them and is part of the reason why they couldn't do what so many other people did, which was move from the hard left to the center left or a kind of soft social democratic left. That wasn't an option for these people because that was precisely the space that they had such contempt for.
We're going to take
a histrionic element to it.
Yeah. Let's grab a quick break. We'll come back and we can come back to that thought. But I'm just watching on the clock here. We'll come back. We'll take a break. I'll be back after this.
Shut the door on immigration, and if a few companies don't pay tax, let's not grumble. What's the harm in that? There's no harm, baby. Prosperity. Let's get rid of foreigners. What he means is let's practice green.
Sure, Ted Cruz says he's a natural-born citizen, but if he gets elected, watch what happens at IHOP. Canadian bacon. You heard it here first. Today's show was produced by Betsy Kaplan, who switched from brushing to flossing, and me, Kyone Wolf. Greg Hill appeared in the intro and tweets for us at WNPR Colin. Our interns are Tiana Duquette and Benjamin Esty. The part of Bill Curry was played by Wendell Wilkie. For show pages, articles, and proof that Now and Here switch to Here and Now, go to our website, WNPR.org/Colin. On tomorrow's show, the influence of basketball on Obama and vice versa. And now, back to Colin.
Yeah, I do feel like it's almost a little bit of an arc from today's show to tomorrow's show. We'll be talking to Alexander Wolf from Sports Illustrated, who wrote The Audacity of Hoop, which is about the love that President Obama has for the game of basketball, the way that it may have actually shaped his governing style, his campaigning style, and the way in which he may have had an impact on basketball and its status in this country. And joining us for that conversation will be Jamal Wilkes, formerly of the Lakers and UCLA, and Brandon Sherrod, who plays basketball for Yale and took a year off to become a whiff and poof, which... which he'll just be known for that for the rest of his life. Although you'll find out something on the show about Brandon Sherrod politically tomorrow that will interest you. Anyway, that's tomorrow. We're talking about today right now, and we're talking to two people who are very interested in how people's political beliefs are shaped and how they evolve. Michael Lind is co-founder of the New America Foundation, author of many books, including most relevantly Up From Conservatism, Why the Right is Wrong for America. Daniel Oppenheimer's new book is called Exit Right, The People Who Left the Left and Reshaped the American Century. Tonight in beautiful South Hadley at the Odyssey Bookstore, he will be, what time are you going to be there?
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock. So you can go there and he actually will, like he could probably just convert you or something, or you could just say, I'd like to switch from such and such, and he'll lay his hands on your shoulders and
I'll bring the holy water. Yeah,
right, exactly. He'll sprinkle some water on you, and you can change. All right, our time is pressed a little bit here, and I would like to talk a little bit about the contemporary scene. There are a lot of people around right now who have done things kind of like this, although I think our guests would argue not really like this. And Michael Lind, maybe I'll start with Michael Bloomberg. Now, some people probably simply change parties, not because they've changed political philosophy, but maybe they think the field is too crowded over in one party. Or, I mean, what do you make of a persona like Michael Bloomberg switching parties?
Well, I think for Bloomberg, you have to look at him in his context, which is the very wealthy elites in both parties tend to share a worldview increasingly. They tend to be in favor of globalization, large-scale immigration. They tend to be socially liberal. At the same time, they're fiscally conservative, and they want to cut Social Security and Medicare and so on, arguably to keep taxes from going up on people in their income group, in my opinion. But that's kind of, there's a corporate boardroom worldview where the wealthy Democratic donors and the Republican donors actually have more in common with each other than they do with most of the voters in their own parties. And I think Bloomberg's centrism, I would be very surprised if it would find many voters if he ran for president. I think essentially it's very much a kind of an elite subculture.
And Daniel, I mean, we keep coming back to this idea, but I think it's probably worth saying that when you wouldn't think maybe there would be a lot that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton would have in common, but maybe they do have in common the reality that they don't really have a taste for that unfiltered whatever it is, that they react pretty situationally. I mean, as I said earlier in the show, Hillary Clinton did grow up with a strongly Republican father. In '64, she was a Goldwater girl. She was in Wellesley. She said she was, a liberal at heart and a conservative at brain. Now, of course, she's emphatically a Democrat. But, and I think you said, Trump has sort of jumped back and forth a bunch of times, that there are people who they kind of read the way the water's breaking at any given moment, as opposed to only being able to drink out of one tap.
Yeah, I think that's right, although I think that they're sort of examples of that in very different ways. So Trump actually has had a certain consistency of worldview in the sense that if you go back as far as he's on the public record, he's always talking about winning. He's always been nativist in one way or another, though it's not always the Mexicans and the Muslims. It might be the Japanese or Chinese, depending on the context. He's always been a great celebrator of business acumen and common sense and deal making as the highest virtues, not just of business life, but of political life, and I think life in general. So that's been a consistency. The policies that he attaches to those kind of shift, depending, I think, what, as you're saying, on the political context, but also maybe sometimes what he read, yesterday, and also which leaders of which party are being nice to him at a given moment. Whereas Hillary, it's interesting. She suffers for this. I mean, since she moved to the left, she's had a pretty good consistency of core political views, but she seems so sort of situational in all these other ways, and it's interesting that it's Trump who can excite people with this sort of core of outview, but core of worldview, but incredible promiscuity of policy. And it's Hillary who's always disappointing people with a kind of consistent policies, but a kind of fluidity of I don't know how she expresses that and where she arrives precisely in terms of where she's going to come down at a particular moment.
Michael and I have a question for you, but did you just want to react to that instead? Or?
No, go ahead and ask your question.
Well, I guess my question for you is like what we see right now, and it's sort of back to your point about how within dichotomized ideological divisions between right and left, there are these kind of subgroups. And so you have a Trump, you have a Cruz, you have a Rubio, you have a Bush. They're all going after more or less conservative voters right now in order to secure a Republican nomination. You have Sanders, you have Clinton also going after nominally liberal voters to secure a Democratic nomination, but with often pretty widely disparate messages. So what do we make of that in terms of the conversation we're having right now?
Well, I think, as I suggested earlier, you have a two-party, 5 ideology or 6 worldview system. Mm-hmm. So there are at least 2 worldviews within the Democratic Party. There's the so-called neoliberals like Bill and Hillary Clinton, who are more moderate on economic issues, socially liberal. And then there's your classic progressive social democrats like Bernie Sanders. So then on the right, you have classic populists like Donald Trump. You have very socially liberal libertarians who are the opposite extreme. And then you have the so-called movement conservatives who try to navigate between these 2 groups. And so I think most people, they're not right and left are geographic directions, but it doesn't. You need additional instructions on the map. So once you are in right or left wing territory, then you have to decide: are we on the left in social democratic land or in neoliberal land?
Right. So we're just about out of time, Daniel Oppenheimer. But so often as people navigate that process, people may identify as a certain thing. They may say I'm a liberal or I'm a conservative, or they may go into a little bit more micro with some of the different worldviews that Michael's talking about. But then ultimately, are they just trying to map that onto a particular candidate? Or I feel as though the way that we react to candidates goes further than that.
I think, and I think that's right. I think Michael's typology was very astute, but then it's like the more micro you get, the more complicated and often incoherent it is, because beyond that, for most of us, you have a very visceral attachment to certain personality types. Donald Trump looked at Bill Clinton and he seemed like his kind of guy in just some visceral way. And he looks at Barack Obama and it just pushes his buttons. He's not his type of guy. So along with all of those sort of political typologies, that it's even more complex than that, because we're assuming that individual people who are not sort of political professionals or journalistic professionals have a coherent ideology and have a coherent worldview. And in fact, I think often they don't. And often, even if they do, it can be in tension with all sorts of other things going on in their psyche that they may or may not be aware of.
Right. Not surprisingly, David Brooks today has a column about Donald Trump about manners. I think we can end with that. But thank you so much to Michael Lind for joining us from the D.C. studios of NPR. Daniel Oppenheimer's right here in studio. Run on up to South Hadley, Massachusetts, if that's anywhere near your orbit, he'll be there tonight at the Odyssey Bookstore.
Listen up now, parties are fun. Democrats or Republicans. Hey, hey, whoa, whoa, stop the party. Listen up now, party. Time to get in your political stance. Hey, hey, Democrats, Republicans, it's time. Listen up now, parties are fun. Democrats or Republicans.
Goodbye, Hillary 2008 highlighter. Goodbye, I like Ike button. Goodbye, Ulysses S. Grant beer koozie. And good riddance, John Adams retractable lanyard holder. Real Americans prefer their lanyards stationary.